Ayn Rand, the greatest ethical philosopher. What is ethics, and how does Ayn Rand's ethical philosophy differ from every other philosopher's? According to Google AI, ethics is a set of moral principles that guide behavior by distinguishing between what is right and wrong. It's a branch of philosophy that examines what is good for individuals and society, and provides a framework for making decisions in situations with competing interests. Ethics helps us consider the consequences of our actions and strives for standards that are reasonable, well-founded, and contribute to the common good. Grok defines ethics as the branch of philosophy that systematically studies what is moral, good and bad, right and wrong, virtuous and vicious, and how human beings should live and act. Two of the core questions, according to Grok, are: what do we owe each other, and how should we organize society so that it's just? Both of these definitions are at best vague and circular, and by bringing in society, they're confusing political philosophy with ethical philosophy. In addition, both of these definitions are collectivist. For instance, the question, what do we owe each other, is by definition a collectivist loaded question. And in Google's case, how can we contribute to the common good? From my point of view, both of these are very poor definitions, and they differ from what Rand's definition of ethics is. So, from the very beginning, Rand distinguishes herself from other ethical philosophers by giving a definition of ethics which is different than theirs. In her book on ethics, entitled The Virtue of Selfishness, she asks, what is morality or ethics? It's a code of values that guide man's choices and actions, the choices and actions that determine the purpose and course of his life. Ethics as a science deals with the discovery of and defining such a code. The first question that has to be answered as a precondition of any attempt to define, to judge, or to accept any specific system of ethics is, why does man need a code of values? She writes, let me stress this. The first question is not what particular code of values should man accept. The first question is, does man need a code of values at all, and why? This profound question by Rand leads to a firm foundation in ethics, as opposed to the free-floating definitions given by Google AI and Grok, which just says that ethics is about what is right and wrong. Right and wrong by what standard? Ayn Rand was born Alicia Rosenbaum in Russia in 1905. She lived through the Bolshevik Revolution, in which her family lost everything. She immigrated to the United States in 1926 and became a naturalized citizen in 1931. On Ayn Rand's second day in Hollywood, Cecil B. DeMille saw her standing at the gate of his studio. He offered her a ride to the set of his movie, The King of Kings, and gave her a job first as an extra and then as a scriptwriter. She sold her first screenplay, Red Pond, to Universal Pictures in 1932, and saw her first stage play, Night of January 16th, produced in Hollywood and then on Broadway. Her novel, The Fountainhead, came out in 1943, and her magnus opus, Atlas Shrugged, came out in 1957 and brought her worldwide recognition for her ideas. She died in New York City in 1982 at the age of 77. In order to better understand the genius of Ayn Rand, let's examine the history of ethical philosophers by the category of ethical philosophy they were proposing. Like most philosophical questions, let's begin with Aristotle and Plato, who both proposed a form of virtue ethics. Virtue ethics is like a bunch of wise man aphorisms. It's usually a list of virtues and vices, those things that you should do and those things that you should avoid. The goal is to help you live a better life. I think this should come with a warning like Voltaire's. It's dangerous to be right in matters on which the established authorities are wrong. According to Plato, virtue is achieved when each part of the soul performs its proper function in harmony with reason and control. Wisdom is the virtue of reason. Courage is the virtue of spirit. Moderation is the virtue of appetite. Justice is the overall harmony and balance achieved when all three parts are working together correctly, according to Plato. Ethics is about pursuing these virtues in balance. According to Plato, people are not born virtuous, but become so through training and repetition, especially during childhood. Aristotle also proposed a form of virtue ethics. The goal of being an ethical person was to attain eudaimonia, which is flourishing or having a good life. The goal is to attain the right balance between a virtue and its excesses or deficiency, called the golden mean. For example, courage is the mean between recklessness and cowardice. Generosity is the mean between stinginess and profligacy. Aristotle admits most things have a golden mean, but there are some actions like murder and adultery that are inherently wrong and have no virtuous mean. Benjamin Franklin, I think, epitomizes the idea of virtue ethics. He talked about virtues that he was trying to strive for and vices he was trying to avoid in his publication, Poor Richard's Almanac. Confucius was another virtue ethicist. Confucius' ethics is a system of social philosophy that emphasizes moral integrity, harmony, and respect through focus on specific virtues and social roles. His concepts include Ren, which is humanity or compassion, Li, which are rituals, propriety, and Zhao, piety. Ethical conduct is cultivated through relationships, starting with the family and extending to society, according to Confucius. Highly ethical people contribute to a peaceful and well-ordered society. The next category of ethical theories is deontological ethics. Two of the most well-known examples are Immanuel Kant and the Ten Commandments from Christianity. In deontological ethics, you have duties and rules. The idea is that your duty is to follow the rules set before you, for instance, the Ten Commandments. Kant has his own system of universal laws, which I don't think is worth exploring at this point. The next category we'll examine is consequentialism or utilitarianism. Some of the key figures here include Jeremy Bentham, John Stuart Mill, and Singer. I did a whole video on utilitarianism. The idea behind this is that you're supposed to weigh the total good and the total negative consequences of any action and then decide if the good outweighs the bad, then it's a good action. If the bad outweighs the good for everyone in the world, then it's an action you shouldn't take. Often, this is summarized as the greatest good for the greatest number. The next category is called contractualism. Some of the key figures here are Hobbes, Locke, and Rawls. The question is, what rules would rational people agree to if they were designing a society? I think this confuses political philosophy with ethics. Ethics is not about how you organize society, but how you make decisions for yourself in each situation. Another category is called sentimentalism. It was very popular among 18th century British ethical philosophers, such as Francis Hutcheson, David Hume, and Adam Smith. I think it's very important to understand that Adam Smith wrote a whole book on this called The Theory of Moral Sentiments, which he wrote before The Wealth of Nations. I think it puts to bed the whole idea that Smith was promoting rational selfishness. Sentimentalism argues that moral judgments are fundamentally based on feelings and emotion rather than on reason. David Hume argued that reason is irrelevant to ethical philosophy, and his famous is-ought problem, which says that basically you can't go from facts to what you ought to do. In that sense, I would say Hume is an ethical nihilist, much like Nietzsche. A famous line from David Hume is, Reason is and ought only to be a slave of passion. Lastly, I think we should talk about an ethical theory that is very popular in today's mainstream media and academia: altruism. Altruism was first coined by Auguste Comte. I've done a whole video on altruism, but Comte said altruism cannot tolerate the notion of rights, for such a notion rests on individualism. According to him, we are born under a load of obligations of every kind, to our predecessors, to our successors, to our contemporaries, and the ultimate formula for human morality is to live for others. In other words, you can never take yourself into account in an ethical decision. Only self-sacrifice counts as what is ethical. With that overview of the major categories of ethical philosophies, let's go back to Rand's question. Why do human beings need ethics? Why do they need a code of values? The reason humans need a code of values, as Rand points out, is that living things face one fundamental alternative in the universe: existence or non-existence. The existence of inanimate matter is unconditional, while the existence of life is not. It depends on a specific course of action. Humans do not have an instinct. They do not automatically know what is necessary to sustain their life. Thus, they need a code of values in order to live. The alternative is if they don't select the right choices, then they die. You can see that Rand is basing her ethics on biological reality. The biological reality that any living organism faces is the ultimate choice of existence or non-existence, life or death. She further grounds her ethical ideas in biology when she points out that an organism's life depends on two factors: the material or fuel for which it needs from the outside, from its physical background, and the action of its own body, the action of using the fuel properly. What standard determines what is proper in this context? The standard is the organism's life, or that which is required for the organism's survival. She further points out that if an organism fails in its basic functions required by its nature, it dies. And if the species does that, then it goes extinct. So she's basing ethics on biology and evolutionary reality. She also points out that a plant has no choice of action. Its goals it pursues are automatic, determined by its nature. So what is appropriate for a human being? Human beings are rational animals, and this means that their main tool of survival is their ability to reason. She points out that that which is proper for the life of a rational being is good, and that which negates it or opposes it or destroys it is evil. Thus she defines what's good and bad in ethics by basing it in the reality of the biology of human beings. Since man is born tabula rasa, he has no inherent idea of what is good and bad, unlike many philosophers have suggested. He has to discover that which is necessary and proper for a rational being to promote survival, and that which results in evil and causes him pain and death. Rand notes that humans do have an automatic pleasure and pain sensation. Pain gives you an immediate feedback that something is causing harm to your body. But the pain-pleasure mechanism does not tell you how to build a fire, how to build an airplane, how to do open-heart surgery, how to harness oil and turn it into fuel and light and life. It does not give you an automatic code of values. Thus, we can see the genius of Ayn Rand was that she based her ethics on biological reality of human beings and on reason, which is the main tool of survival of human beings. Some people suggest that there's a difference between the requirements for survival and the requirements for thriving, and thus they think that this is a very limited point of view. But there is no such distinction. Thriving is just more living. Thriving is about having more and more energy. And the very definition of being able to survive is to gain enough energy to support one's life. Thus, it's all just a matter of degree. And the same thing that causes you to survive is those things that cause you to thrive. No such distinction makes any sense. This is complete nonsense, and it's pushed by many so-called objectivists. Rand also points out that every person has to think for themselves. They cannot abdicate that responsibility and expect to live. And this is the problem with utilitarianism. It treats every individual as a sacrificial animal who can abdicate the responsibility of thinking. Instead, as Rand points out, that each individual has to make their own decision, and that their life is their own life, not somebody else's. He makes a further point about grounding ethics in objective reality instead of arbitrary whims. He asks the question, who decides what is right and wrong? Nobody decides. Nature does not decide, it merely is. Man does not decide in issues of knowledge. He merely observes that which is, and then he goes on to quote Bacon, nature to be commanded must be obeyed first. This means that a man does not create reality and can achieve its values only by making his decisions consistent with reality. Rand points out that the mind is an attribute of the individual. There's no such thing as a collective brain. There's no such thing as collective thought. Any agreement reached by a group of men is only a compromise or drawn average of men's individual thoughts. Of course, the other thing that she pointed out is each individual has unique circumstances that only their senses can detect. You can't detect and you can't integrate someone else's senses. Every person has to think for themselves. This is similar to Hayek's argument in his book, Fatal Conceit. Like all organisms, the first thing human beings have to do is to survive, to fulfill any other functions. So you have to put your life first, and if you don't do that, then you die. And if the species doesn't do that, then the species goes extinct. No other ethical philosophy thought about basing ethics in biological reality. Locke's argument about man in a state of nature would be the closest. But of course, Locke didn't come up with an ethical philosophy, he came up with a political philosophy. There seems to be a lot of consternation going on in the objectivist community about the role of Rand and Locke. Rand and Locke are very much on the same page. In fact, Rand's political philosophy can be almost taken as just paraphrasing Locke, even though she never mentioned Locke. But that mistake was corrected by Leonard Peikoff. Rand did point out that the basic premise of the Founding Fathers was man's right to his own life, to his own liberty, to the pursuit of his own happiness, which means man's right to exist for his own sake, neither sacrificing himself to others nor sacrificing others to himself. This is straight from John Locke. The genius of John Locke was to reject the common good as the standard of political philosophy. The limitation of Locke's ideas is that it only talked about social interactions or what a proper government does. It doesn't tell you how you should act in any particular situation. It only tells you about interaction. A classic example of the distinction between ethical and political philosophy are the so-called victimless crimes. For instance, I may think that prostitution is a bad idea, that you shouldn't engage in being a prostitute or hiring a prostitute. That's a personal ethical decision. But it does not mean from a political philosophy point of view that there should be a law against prostitution. Or I might think it's a very bad idea to take recreational drugs. But that does not mean I think that the government should have a law against it. That's the distinction between ethics and political philosophy. Another distinction that comes up all the time is when the government steps out of its bounds. For instance, it makes rules about what you can and cannot buy or sell. For instance, raw milk. Thus, it makes these people who buy and sell raw milk criminals. Thus, we can see the distinction between what the government declares is legal and illegal is not what is necessarily what is ethical and unethical. Another recent example, the example of whether you should take an experimental medical treatment, or whether you should do so if the authorities say you should do it for society, or whether you should take an experimental treatment that is the COVID jab for grandma, or whether you should take the experimental COVID jab if your job depends on it. These decisions are based in ethics, not in political philosophy. There are numerous examples like this, and often people get them confused. They think because they think something is bad or shouldn't be done that there should be a law against it, or good and should be promoted that the government should get involved. This causes governmental overreach and creep, and therefore causes the government to become bloated, inefficient, and bureaucratic. Ethics and political philosophy are not the same. They're obviously related, but they're not the same. While Ayn Rand was obviously an incredible genius in ethical philosophy, that was not the only area of philosophy that she worked in. She had profound ideas in metaphysics and epistemology. She also did work in political philosophy and aesthetics. But I think her greatest insight was in basing ethics on the biological reality of human beings. I want to address a couple of specific issues that come up related to Ayn Rand. Socialists love to attack her based on her personal life and her relationships. They're attacking a person who had the courage to leave her homeland and her family behind and came to the United States and worked in Hollywood and then was able to create a successful Broadway play and 2 international bestsellers and create a whole philosophical movement. This is a level of achievement that Karl Marx or any of the so-called continental philosophers could not even dream of. She did this without being a parasite or being paid by a government university system. Ayn Rand's life is the life of a hero. Was she perfect? No. But was she amazing? Showed amazing courage, strength, and perseverance? Yes. The second issue I want to address is her relationship with Nathaniel Branden. Nathaniel Branden was a psychologist, and he convinced Ayn Rand to explore psychological issues, which I think was a major mistake. I don't think her or Branden's insights into psychology, which is basically a pseudoscience, were helpful at all, and it was a distraction from her main philosophical pursuits. However, but for Nathaniel Branden, she almost certainly would not have written any of her nonfiction works, or given as many of her talks. So we can thank Nathaniel Branden for that. So like a Greek tragedy, there's both good and bad when it comes to Nathaniel Branden from my point of view. In conclusion, Ayn Rand was the only philosopher ever to create a scientific objective basis for ethics, basing it on the biological reality of human beings. This was a brilliant insight and a departure from the nonsensical, free-floating, not abstracts provided by ethical philosophers that came before Rand. She also had a number of brilliant insights into many other areas of philosophy. Rand's ethical philosophy is profoundly American. Long live freedom, damn it.